All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Tom Hartka. I'm here from the University of Virginia. And this is how to use vehicle telemetry data in the emergency department. And the spoiler alert is I don't actually know yet, but I think this is an area that we need to look into. So to start, I have no disclosures. So I am a practicing ER physician. And in addition to that, though, I have some other interests. So I work at the Center for Applied Biomechanics. So this is an example of one of the tests that we do. We do automotive safety work, Department of Defense work. We do cadaveric testing in order to improve safety devices, test protective equipment, and that kind of thing. I also work on the SIREN project. So the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, NHTSA, collects a ton of data about car crashes, and they've been doing this for decades. There's a large database called NAS where they collect like 1,000 data points on each crash that they investigate. And along with that, they collect all the injuries that the occupants sustained as a result of those crashes. And they do detailed analysis of it. And that's where you're going to see a lot of this data coming from. There's a subset of that, of NAS, which is SIREN, which is what I'm a part of, the Crash Injury Research and Engineering Network. And we just do a little bit of a more deeper dive into these cases. And we take every injury that they sustained, all the way down from bruises to torn aortas, and figure out which element of the vehicle caused the force that resulted in that injury. And I also work as a medical examiner. This was an unfortunate young man who died as a result of a MVC. So I see motor vehicle collisions in a variety of different venues. And this is my area of research. And I think there are things we can do to take better care of these patients. So I'd like to start with a story. So this is a story of a 19-year-old female who was driving on one of the rural roads around Charlottesville. She lost control of her vehicle, went off the road, and hit a tree. Passersby saw this crash occur. They called 911. EMS was there promptly. She was a little bit upset by this crash, which is not terribly surprising. So she was trauma alerted prior to getting to the hospital. She arrived at our emergency department. The trauma team was there. The ER team was there. It was difficult to get a good exam, but because of the mechanism, the decision was made to do a pan scan. She was scanned. There were no injuries, and she was brought back to the ED. They were able to calm her down, and she was ultimately discharged in the care of her parents. So in some ways, this is a success story. This is our trauma system working perfectly. EMS was at the scene quickly. The trauma team and the ER team were ready for her in the emergency department. She didn't have any injuries, at least none on CT, and she was discharged. But there's another side to this story. So this turns out to be the daughter of one of my colleagues. And a couple weeks later, they got a bill for this ER stay. So this was the trauma alert, the pan scan, the ED bill. And it was $27,000 for a patient who ultimately didn't have any injuries. And this is not just UVA. There's research into catastrophic medical bills, and this is common in trauma all over the United States. Not only that, she has maybe a 1 in 2,000 chance of getting a cancer that will kill her because of the radiation she received from these CT scans. So I really think that we can do better with occupants who've been in car crashes. And one of the ways I think we can do that is through vehicle telemetry data. So I wanted to describe what vehicle telemetry data is and how it can be communicated, some basic concepts of car crashes, PDOF and delta V, talk about some of the characteristics of car crashes that really influence injury risk, and then talk about some of the resources that are out there for car crash research. So the most important thing I want you to take away from this lecture is it's not an accident. When my residents come up and try to tell me about a patient who they saw who's been in a motor vehicle accident, I just stare at them blankly because I have no idea what they're talking about. I think what they mean is a motor vehicle collision or a motor vehicle crash. Trauma is a disease. It's like other diseases. We know what causes it. Drinking and driving is not an accident. Texting and driving is not an accident. And if you think of it as an accident, that almost feels like there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Really, when there are interventions, if you saw those graphs from today, the number of deaths from motor vehicle collisions is plummeting. It's a disease that is intervenable. So just strike accident from your vocabulary. If you submit a manuscript to the BMJ, they will not accept the word accident if you're talking about MVCs. So what typically happens? There's a crash, someone sees it, calls 911, the dispatcher dispatches an ambulance, and the patient is brought to the hospital. Maybe some information is communicated ahead of time. If your vehicle has an airbag in it, then it has accelerometers to determine when to deploy the airbag. So any vehicle from the last 20 years has these accelerometers, and they're connected to a black box within the vehicle called an event data recorder. And this records what was happening 5 seconds before the crash and the crash impulse. And you can go to a vehicle that has been in a crash and download this information. So you can get this in real time. The EDR is collecting this data, and it can be transmitted automatically to a dispatcher. All you need is basic cell phone technology in the vehicle. And this could also be sent directly to the hospital. And therefore, without anyone ever seeing the crash, EMS could be dispatched. While in high population density areas, that's not a big deal, but a lot of the crashes occur in rural areas where this really could make a difference. And then this data could be waiting in the emergency department by the time the occupant gets there. So this is not a new concept that I came up with. This is actually a framework known as Advanced Automatic Crash Notification. The CDC put together a task force to investigate this, and they made this report in 2008, recommending that we incorporate vehicle telemetry data into our care. And who is getting vehicle telemetry data in real time in their emergency department? Yeah, no one. So if you have OnStar will actually do that. They will upload crash information and will call dispatchers, and BMW does it. But aside from that, it doesn't happen. And that even when that happens, that data almost never makes it to the emergency department. So how do we describe car crashes? So this is an example of a crash test. I think this was done in Wisconsin. You can see it's kind of a chaotic event, so we need some ways to describe what's going on. So we talk about PDOF and delta V. So PDOF is the principal direction of force. So you can think of these two vehicles impacting one another, or you can think of this as a vector of a speed and a direction. And this has a big impact on what injuries people sustain. We describe this based on a clock face, with 12 o'clock being the front hood, or you can do it 0 to 360 degrees. So the crash we just saw would have been a 10 o'clock hit or a 300-degree PDOF. So this matters because the vehicle is going to move in the direction of impact. And the occupant, unless they're well coupled to the vehicle, are just going to continue to move in the same line at the same speed. So the vehicle is going to move out from underneath them. So you can see if you're not wearing your seatbelt, you're going to wind up in the A-pillar, which is that bar between the windshield, the front window, and the side window. So a lot of times what we'll talk about is the occupant moving, when it's actually the vehicle moving out from underneath them. But the occupant's going to move in the opposite direction of the PDOF. And not surprisingly, you wind up with injuries on the side of the body that is moving towards a hard part of the vehicle. And it makes a difference. These are two frontal collisions. However, one of them is an 11 o'clock hit, one's a 1 o'clock hit, and these wind up being very different because in the vehicle on the left, the occupant's going to move outboard and towards the door and other hard parts of the vehicle. On the 1 o'clock hit, they're going to move inboard. And there typically isn't a lot of things in the middle of the vehicle, and the console's pretty soft, so it's much better to be in that 1 o'clock hit than the 11 o'clock. And what I've done is I went to the NAS database. It has all the injuries, so I could calculate the injury severity score. And I made models just looking at determining the likelihood that a patient will have a severe injury as a AIS 16 plus injury. So this is your probability of injury, and based on your delta V, which I'll talk about in a minute. But what you can see is this top line is a near side collision. So this means you're the driver, you get hit on the driver's side door. That turns out to be bad. Your vehicle, it's hard to protect someone in a side impact like that because there's not a lot of real estate between you and that impacting vehicle. And also, your vehicle isn't really made to protect you in side impacts. Now they're doing side airbags and some devices to help you out. But on the whole, most of the testing has been done for frontal impacts. And that's what your seatbelt's really designed to protect you for. So you can see your risk of severe injury is highest for a near side impact. After that is a far side. So again, your seatbelt doesn't really work that well if you're getting hit on the opposite side of the car. A frontal is even better, and then by far the best is a rear-end collision. People are almost never severely injured in a rear-end collision because you're getting pushed into a nice soft seat. So that turns out to be the best case. And then with delta V, we talk about delta V all the time. So it's not the speed that kills you, it's the deceleration at the end. So delta V is change in velocity. So if you were to drive your vehicle off a 30-foot cliff, when you hit the ground, you'd be going 30 miles per hour downward. And if you stop right away, that is a 30 mile per hour delta V. You're going from 30 to 0. And it turns out that a 30 mile per hour delta V is a pretty big hit, which is surprising because this is the speed you'll go around a residential road. I still have no idea why they actually made this video. It was given to me by someone, but the more traditional way of doing crash testing is like this, where you run a vehicle into a barrier. And this is a 35 mile per hour delta V at the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety, which I'm not associated with, although they're around us. They do fantastic work there. If you're ever buying a new car, I would recommend going to their website and looking at their safety ratings. It's hard to figure out what the delta V is just by looking at photos of the vehicles. These all turn out to be 30 mile per hour delta Vs. If you're practicing in the emergency department, you've probably had that experience where the EMS provider comes in with their cell phone with a photo of the crashed car and wants to show it to you. And I always look at it and nod sagely. But it's really hard to take a lot of information away from that. But again, vehicles have EDRs, so we can see exactly what was going on during that collision. And going back to this graph, delta V makes a huge difference on your risk of injury. If your delta V is 10, your risk of severe injury is almost 0. Whereas, if you get up to a 35 mile per hour frontal, now you're getting around 15 to 20% risk of a severe injury. The other two factors that make a big difference are age and belt status. These top two lines are unbelted occupants. The bottom lines are belted occupants. And the top line is female versus male. There's a slightly higher risk for females in crashes than males. But the much bigger difference is between being belted or not. For about all speeds, your risk of being severely injured, it's about double if you're not wearing your seatbelt. And you'll see the same thing for fatalities. Your risk of dying in a crash is about twice as high if you're not wearing your seatbelt. And on this chart, what you're seeing is age along the bottom. So age makes a big difference, too. As people get older, they get more frail. So this is a 35 mile per hour delta V frontal, and what you see is if you're 15 and you're wearing your seatbelt, your risk is about 10% of a severe injury. But if you're 65, that's almost 30%. And it just keeps going up from there. So the biggest determinants of whether you're injured are the direction of the impact, the change in velocity of the impact, your age, and whether you're wearing your seatbelt or not. And it's hard to know this information when we're treating patients, although it's critical to determining their risk of injury. So if we went back to that first case, what do we see? So this is a 19-year-old female. She's belted in a sedan, 55 mile per hour delta V frontal. And what do we see? We see that the risks of having a CT positive injury, so for each body region, I just did that same regression, looking for any internal injury. And you can see the risk of internal injury is pretty high. It's 30% for the head, chest is almost 60%, abdomen's 40%. So this probably was a patient that should have been pan-scanned. It would actually make sense. However, we don't really know if this delta V is accurate. Looking at vehicles fall apart, so it's a little difficult to say, but on the internal pictures of this vehicle, there's no intrusion, which is odd for a 55 mile per hour delta V. So what if the delta V was actually 35 miles per hour? Then all of a sudden, these risks look a lot different. The risk of a head injury is still 17%. So that's fairly high, but chest and abdomen have gone down considerably. So maybe this is a patient who we take over, get a stat head CT, and then bring her back. Give her a chance to calm down a little bit. Maybe use the Denver algorithm for ruling out abdominal injury, or it might be an opportunity for some shared decision making. But if we don't have this data, we can't really make good decisions. And this may sound futuristic, but actually in Europe they've implemented something called eCall, which is the first step in this AACN algorithm, where they're automatically notifying dispatchers about crashes. They're not getting the delta V and the crash impulse yet, but that's probably coming. So there are actually a lot of resources out there to do research in this area. These are four of the databases that I've used. There's NAS, which is a nationally representative sample. It's free. You can just go on NHTSA's website and download decades worth of crash data. Siren is also publicly available, although it's not nationally representative. There's NHAMICS that's also free and has some injury information in there, and NTDB, which you have to pay for. But I really want to encourage people to join me in this research. There's not a lot of people working in this area right now, and most of the people that are trauma surgeons, and I feel like we are even better equipped to understand car crashes and what it means for our patients, because there are a ton of patients that we care for without the trauma surgeons ever being involved. So I would want to encourage emergency medicine doctors to get involved in this field. I'd like to acknowledge NHTSA for their support, UVA for their support through the Thrive program, NIH for their support through the LRP program. I'd also like to acknowledge the UVA basketball team for a fantastic tournament after losing in the first round last year. It was a great comeback. And with that, I'd like to take any questions. I don't know if they want us to use them.
Ron Perello with the University of South Carolina School of Medicine in Greenville. You presented your telemetry information, but my understanding is that those data are not in those data sets. So where did you get the telemetry?
So That is a great point. So most of the car crashes that are in NAS and SAEM don't have it, but NAS has been replaced by SIS, and they're trying to get it on every vehicle. And they've had about 65% success right now. So moving forward, so the PDOFs and the Delta Vs I used for my research were actually determined by a crash investigator going out to the vehicle and doing detailed measurements.
The other question I have is, those data, I recall when the CDC's paper came out, about whose information that was. Was that the patient's information? Was it the owner's information of the vehicle? Or was that the manufacturer's information? Or was that the insurer's information?
And I think that's been one of our big barriers to actually getting this data in real time is, what are the implications? And there was actually a law that was passed in 2014 that says that the owner or leaser of a vehicle owns this data. And they get to decide how it's going to be used, except if it's used for medical care, research, if it's subpoenaed, and there was one other reason you could use it. But it's the owner of the vehicle. All right. Oh, question? You mean it's kind of just using data that you can get at the scene Yeah, and these models are made for that kind of thing, these logistic regression models that I put together, so that you get so I did likelihood of injury, but you could conceivably come up with like a binary score, yes or no. But it also brings up questions like, what is your tolerance for injury? Like, how high of a chance of having a splenic injury is too high, and that kind of thing, which is an important question. We'll have to look at that at some time in the future.
Last one from all I have. We've been talking about this for about 15 years. Why hasn't it moved forward? It just makes so much sense.
Again, I think one of the big problems has been who owns that data, and another problem is that the communication system, the dispatcher systems are different all over the country. With the enhanced 911, that actually may get better. As more systems go to an enhanced 911 system, it'll be easier to get this data to them in real time. And then you have to pay to put a cell phone into these vehicles. And the manufacturers, unless they're forced to do it, have been a little resistant to that.
But the 911 answer towards the wrong place for the data.
Yeah.
One of the answers is you need one or two vehicles, for someone out in Charlottesville, for instance, just get it. Someone out in the rural area, notifying 911's useful beyond that.
Yeah. And it could go to a central area. And like I said, in Europe, they're implementing e-calls. So it's not, there's no real conceptual barriers to doing this. And I think it will be coming in the future, but we'll see. Yeah, and that's interesting. So you want, your cell phone's going to fly all around during a crash. So it's hard to use accelerometers from your phone, but you could easily think of your phone being that cellular connection that, your cell phone's connected to your vehicle by the Bluetooth, and then just uploading the data that way. Just none of the manufacturers have implemented that kind of communication in there. And also that OBI thing port down by your knee in your vehicle, that's how you typically download the EDR data. You could put a dongle in there and automatically download it conceivably. Yeah.
Well, this all just happened a lot faster once we have automatic cars in 20 years. Like, are we really is this going to be automated cars in the market? I'm not sure.
It's a good question. There's probably still going to be crashes with automated cars, and a lot of people die every year. Even if we reduce that by 95%, we're still going to have a lot of deaths, and I think there's still going to be a place for getting this data in the ED. All right. Well, thank you guys very much, and feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to discuss this further.